Welcome to today's CAEF web talk in our series, Anti-Zionism in the Age of Wokeism, featuring Dr. Joan Lurie and Dina Rovner, both of whom are experts on the systemic anti-Semitism in the United Nations. Anti-Zionism is the main source of today's anti-Semitism, though it seems that all sources of Jew hatred are running strong and even increasing. While anti-Semitism morphs, the UN and its many agencies are making use of every trope, every evil incarnation of Jew hatred, and are at the apex of global anti-Semitism. CAEF is a registered charitable organization with limited resources, but increasing connectivity with organizations around the globe. We are eager to cooperate on many issues and to develop shared strategies, particularly on matters like defunding UNRWA, exposing anti-Semitism in critical race theory, listing Islamist organizations on the Canadian terror watch list, and researching the impact of anti-Semitism on faculty and students at universities across the country. We see that as Islamist anti-Israel provocation rises in the US, it's quickly replicated in Canada. We are seeing that attacks against Jews and Jewish businesses in Toronto has increased as anti-Israel protests have grown in magnitude, in intensity, and frequency. We see the exclusion of Jewish students from some aspects of university life and harassment and discrimination increase as the vocal outrage of anti-Zionist protests dominate the campus and student federation. These are but a few of the issues here and across North America that affect all Jews. Our webinars and the CAEF Bulletin are intended to inform, educate, and motivate people to take action. Please support our programs with a donation online at www.caef.ca or in the US via our partner, the Lawfare Project. CAEF welcomes partners, and today I'm pleased to thank and list those organizations which have helped to promote this webinar. Our two co-presenters are UN Watch Canada and the Jewish NGOs at the UN, and our co-sponsors are the International Council of Jewish Women, the Bedin Center for Near East Policy Research, Allied Voices for Israel, European Lawyers for Israel, the Israel Activist Calendar, the Israel Action Committee of East Bay, the Mattathias Project, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, End Jew Hatred Canada, Bridges for Peace, Club Z, Americans for Peace and Tolerance, the New Hampshire for Israel, Adath Israel Congregation, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, Beth Tikva Congregation, the Lodger Center Congregation, Cherut Canada, Americans for a Safe Israel, the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, and the Israel Committee of Sonoma County. It's a great pleasure to have so many collaborative organizations, and we welcome others who would like to share information or sponsor our webinars. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, two women of distinction working tirelessly on behalf of all of us at the international level, and I think thus exposing themselves to some of the worst anti-Semitic rhetoric and lies. Dina Rovner is the legal advisor for UN Watch. She's responsible for maintaining the UN Watch database, which is a digital advocacy tool that's revolutionizing how activists and ordinary citizens around the world monitor the UN and combat anti-Israel bias. Dina appears at the UN and researches and writes legal briefs, UN submissions, and reports on human rights and the UN's bias against Israel. Recent publications include UNRWA Hate Starts Here, How UNRWA Teachers Indoctrinate Palestinian Children and Promote Terrorism and Antisemitism. Agenda number 7, Country Claims in UN Watch Responses, and Who Guards the Guardians, Evaluation of UNHRC Candidates for 2024 and to 26. Prior to joining UN Watch, Dina worked for 5 years as a lawyer for Shirat Hadin, representing victims of terrorism in lawsuits against state sponsors of terrorism and other defendants in US courts. Dr. Joan Lurie is a physicist who spent much of her career observing Earth from satellites. I think that's the best way to look at Earth today, actually, Joan. She has represented International Council of Jewish Women at the UN in New York for more than 15 years. She's a member of the Executive Committee of ICJW and is co-chair of the Jewish NGOs at the UN in New York, which includes members from 33 countries. She also represents ICJW on the board of the American section of the World Jewish Congress. Joan is very aware of the hateful curriculum of the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which educates Palestinian Arab children to hate Jews, to deny Israel's right to exist, and to foment violence against Israelis. This includes training for terrorism in summer camps operating under the auspices of UNRWA, which is very much an entity deeply connected with Hamas. Joan has authored and co-authored papers on the anti-Semitism at the UN and may tell us about some of their projects and how we in the US and Canada can and must work towards our governments cutting funds to UNRWA. After the presentations, I'll take a few questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A on your screen. If you post on chat, please indicate where you are and please be respectful. And now, welcome, Dina. Would you begin?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you very much for having me and for organizing this webinar, Andrea. So I'm here as the legal advisor for UN Watch. And what I want to do is I'm going to give a broad overview about how the UN singles out Israel, focusing on the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the UN response to October 7th. So for the first 2 months after October 7th, we were reviewing the official UN statements every day to see how the different UN bodies and officials were responding. Specifically the Secretary General, the High Commissioner, different UN human rights experts, and bodies like the World Health Organization and UN Women, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. So the Secretary General issued a pretty strong statement on October 7th. He condemned the Hamas attack in the strongest terms, but in the end, at the end of the statement, instead of affirming Israel's right to self-defense, he said we should avoid a wider conflagration and also that violence cannot solve the problem. Now, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, he also issued a similar kind of statement. His statement actually also addressed the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. So when he was talking about October 7th, the Hamas attack, he also added something about Israel's airstrikes in Gaza. And he called for an immediate stop to the violence on all sides. And like the Secretary General, he did not mention Israel's right to self-defense. Now, we also have a special coordinator for Middle East peace, that's Tor Wennesland, and he also vehemently condemned the attack. But then he added this very dramatic language at the end about being on a dangerous precipice and the need to pull back from the brink. And he also didn't say anything about Israel's right to self-defense. Humanitarian bodies like UN Women and the WHO waited several days before issuing any statements. The WHO's first statement was on October 10th, and it called for an end to the hostilities and spoke of the Hamas atrocities in the same breath as the Gazans being killed and injured in Israel's airstrikes, creating this false moral equivalence, which we've seen a lot. And then the UN Women's statement on October 13th was kind of similar. It didn't even mention Hamas's widespread sexual crimes against Israeli women, and I'm sure many of you followed the intense campaign against UN Women on that issue. So what we found was that over the next 2 months, the statements got worse and worse. And I'm sure many of you remember that famous October 25th statement by the Secretary General, where he said nothing can justify what Hamas did. But then he went on to say that it didn't happen in a vacuum and to talk about the 56 years of occupation and Palestinian grievances. So in effect, he was kind of justifying it. And he also implied in his statements that Israel was violating international law. He said this many times, even wars have rules. And he's also accused Israel of collective punishment, basically suggesting that Israel's punishing the Palestinian people for Hamas's actions. But he has never condemned Hamas, for example, for using human shields. And it's been the same with the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So these officials, and what we saw just in general in all the statements, was this complete moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas, even though it's Hamas that indiscriminately attacks Israeli civilians with its rocket. They insist on also accusing Israel of indiscriminately or even intentionally targeting Gaza civilians. They rarely criticize Hamas, and when they do, it's very indirect. Hamas is never called a terrorist group. The statements never address the existential nature of the Hamas threat or Hamas's vow to repeat October 7th again and again. And they don't recognize Israel's right or need to self-defense. Now, that was kind of a little bit of an introduction. Now I'm going to take a step back and we'll look a little bit at the bigger picture. And just to borrow a phrase from the Secretary General, the point is that these UN statements didn't just appear out of a vacuum. This is something that's been going on for a very long time. So every year, the UN General Assembly adopts between 14 and 15 resolutions against Israel and only 5 to 7 on the rest of the world. So this past year in 2023, for example, there were 14 resolutions on Israel and 7 on the rest of the world combined, which is 50% of the resolutions being on Israel. There was 1 resolution on North Korea, 1 resolution on Syria, 1 on Iran, 1 on Myanmar, a couple on Russia's violations in Ukraine, another 1 resolution on the US embargo on Cuba. And then, of course, you have 0 resolutions on abuses by China, Turkey, Pakistan, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries. And Andrea mentioned our database when she was talking about, when she introduced me, but I invite you to check out the UN Watch database, which you can find at www.unwatch.org/database, where we track and analyze country resolutions from different UN bodies, including from the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, which I'll get to a bit later. But what I want to say about these resolutions, it's not just the volume of the resolutions, which obviously is disproportionate. It's also the content, the redundancy, and the complete one-sidedness. So every year, there's 1 resolution singling out Israel for creating a risk of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. I'm talking about Israel, not Iran. And actually, the UNGA has never addressed Iranian-sponsored terrorism that creates conflict all over the Middle East. Every year, there is also 1 resolution criticizing Israel for environmental damage in Lebanon during the 2006 war with Hezbollah. No condemnation of Hezbollah for damage that it caused with its thousands of rockets during that war. Every year, there are two resolutions on the Israeli occupation of the Syrian Golan. There's never any praise of Israel, for example, for providing medical treatment to sick and injured Syrians, which it did for a number of years. And another topic that we'll get to later, every year there are 3 resolutions on Palestinian refugees, including the resolution that perpetuates UNRWA, the refugee agency just for the Palestinians. Now, I also want to mention here 3 resolutions that are biannual. So they weren't adopted this year, but they were adopted last year. And these 3 resolutions come up every 2 years. They perpetuate biased UN committees and programs. And I think Joan might speak about this in her presentation. And it's just, you know, how the UN devotes so much resources, just financial, human resources to this issue of the Palestinians. Now, it's important to understand, what I want you to understand is that even though General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding, and we say this all the time, but they can still be very harmful to Israel. So just the fact that they perpetuate UNRWA, which is a UN body that basically is devoted to keeping the conflict alive by indulging Palestinian false hopes about the right of return, that in itself is already very bad. But let me give you 2 other examples from last year of initiatives that came out of these General Assembly resolutions. So the first example is came out of last year's resolution on the division of Palestinian rights. And that resolution included a paragraph calling to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, which I'm sure many of you know. What is the Nakba? It is the catastrophe of the creation of the State of Israel according to the Palestinians. So last year, on May 15th, for the first time ever, the UN hosted an official commemoration of the Palestinian Nakba at its New York headquarters, which is basically like celebrating the day that Israel was created, a UN member state, the day that it came into existence, as a catastrophe according to the Palestinian narrative. I mean, I think that's pretty outrageous. Now, another example that I wanted to give you from last year's resolutions is from this resolution that's called Israeli Practices Affecting the Human Rights of the Palestinian People. And last year in that resolution, there was a request for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, basically on the legality of the occupation. So many of you might not know, but right now there are actually 2 cases pending in the International Court of Justice relating to Israel. One is this new case by South Africa, which has been in the news, accusing Israel of genocide relating to what's happening now. And this other case that's also pending, which is a request for an advisory opinion by the General Assembly. And this kind of leads me into moving on to the Human Rights Council, which is the main UN body that we follow in Geneva, because actually the reason that that advisory opinion request was included in that resolution last year is that the Human Rights Council's never-ending Commission of Inquiry on Israel, which is led by former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, they published a report I'm not talking about this past October, but the year before in October. They published their report to the General Assembly, finding that the occupation was illegal and recommending that the General Assembly ask for this advisory opinion. So everything kind of follows from each other. Everything is interconnected at the UN. Now, the Human Rights Council is a 47-member body. 64% of its members are non-democracies. It convenes 3 times a year for regular sessions, holds debates under 10 different agenda items, and adopts resolutions. Now, again, these resolutions are non-binding, but they can still have a very negative impact on Israel. So every year, the Human Rights Council adopts 4 to 5 resolutions against Israel and 0 on China, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Cuba. They have 3 resolutions on Syria, only 1 on North Korea, 1 on Iran, and so forth. And last year, one of the resolutions that was adopted on Israel perpetuated what we call the BDS blacklist, meaning they were asking in that resolution for funding and annual reports to update the council's database of businesses operating in the settlements. So you can see how negative things come out of these resolutions. And they can have a real impact. Now, I mentioned that when the council meets, it holds debates under 10 different agenda items. And one of these is the famous agenda item 7, which is the agenda item that singles out Israel for special scrutiny under its own debate at every single Human Rights Council session, because all of the other country situations are dealt with together under the general agenda item 4. And I'll just mention that something interesting happened in 2009 when this changed a little bit, when one of the Israel resolutions, we call it the accountability resolution. It's a resolution endorsing one-sided investigations, like the Goldstone Commission. In 2009, the Human Rights Council actually moved one of the resolutions from agenda item 7 into agenda item 2. And they presented that as something positive because they were taking things out of agenda item 7. But in the end, what it means is that now there's 2 discussions on Israel at every council session, one under agenda item 7 and another one under agenda item 2. So now, because I was asked also to speak about the Commission of Inquiry, I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my talk on that. And I'll give you a little bit of background. I mentioned it in the beginning because that was where that advisory opinion came from for the International Court of Justice, the recommendation from the General Assembly. But this Commission of Inquiry was actually created by the Human Rights Council in its last special session on Israel, which was in May 2021, just after Israel's last war with Hamas. And of course, we do expect that the council will hold a special session on Israel about this current situation, but they haven't announced that yet. And just by way of a side note, the council holds these special sessions, and like the resolutions, it disproportionately targets Israel because there have been more special sessions on Israel than on any other country. But now getting back to this Commission of Inquiry, which was created in May 2021, we call this the Pillay Commission because it's headed by former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay. And she's the chair of the commission, and she's known for being very anti-Israel. When she was the High Commissioner, she impaneled 4 fact-finding missions targeting Israel more than any other country. She permitted the appointment of the notoriously anti-Semitic Richard Falk as the special rapporteur for the Palestinians, and she also convened the 2009 Durban II conference, which was boycotted by most democracies. Since then, on repeated occasions, she has publicly accused Israel of being an apartheid state. In June 2020, she actually signed a petition called Sanction Apartheid Israel. It was a BDS petition that was sponsored by South Africa Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Coalition. And aside from her, the two other commissioners are also very anti-Israel. We have Malun Kotari, who was at the center of a scandal about a year and a half ago where he railed against the Jewish lobby and questioned Israel's right to be a member state at the UN. And then the third commissioner is this Chris Sidoti, who in a June 2022 press conference said that anti-Semitism accusations were being thrown around against the commission like rice at a wedding. So the Commission of Inquiry on Israel, this one, it's different from previous commissions of inquiry in three main ways. One is that the mandate has no end date. Typically, commissions of inquiry are focused on a specific incident and last for about 1 year. But this latest one is perpetual. It never ends. It goes on forever. It will just keep going on and on. So it's kind of like a new permanent body that the UN has created to continuously investigate Israel. The second way that it's different is that it doesn't just focus on what they call the occupied Palestinian territory, but also on what's happening inside Israel. And the third is that the mandate also includes to examine the root causes of the conflict, which includes alleged systematic discrimination based on race, which of course we know means that they're going to find Israel guilty of apartheid. Now, they've already published 4 reports, 2 to the Human Rights Council and 2 to the General Assembly, and every year they publish 2 reports. So this year in 2024, there will be 2 more reports. And aside from declaring the occupation illegal and recommending that the General Assembly ask the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion that I already mentioned, their reports are completely one-sided. They deny Israel's security needs, they downplay the threat of Palestinian terrorism, and they also gaslight anti-Semitism by denying the Jewish community the right to define anti-Semitism and combat it through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. They have called that definition controversial, and they have said that it's being used to suppress free speech rights for Palestinian civil society. That was in their report last June. Now, after October 7th, they waited until October 10th to release their first statement. And let me just quote the first paragraph. This is how they started their statement. They said, there is already clear evidence that war crimes may have been committed in the latest explosion of violence in Israel and Gaza, and all those who have violated international law and targeted civilians must be held accountable for their crimes. So basically, 3 days into this new war, they're already saying that war crimes have been committed by both sides, and they're saying nothing about Israel's right to self-defense. And then later in the statement, when they did address the Hamas attack, they called it a report, like reported, and they didn't name Hamas. This is what they said. They said, reports that armed groups from Gaza have gunned down hundreds of unarmed civilians are abhorrent and cannot be tolerated. Taking civilians hostages and using civilians and human shields are war crimes. So, and then in a later statement, they also accused Israel of reciprocal wrongdoing. And in one statement, they criticized Israel's bombings in Gaza. They talked about the death toll, which of course we know is based on the Hamas health ministry numbers, attacks on hospitals, refugee camps, schools, but they never mentioned Hamas's use of civilians and civilian infrastructure as human shields. So this is what we're dealing with at the UN today. I didn't speak at all about UNRWA because I know that Joan is going to be speaking about that, but that's a whole other player here that has a huge impact on this conflict. There are over 500,000 Palestinians that learn in UNRWA schools and another 20,000 that teach in those schools. So I'll pass it on to Joan and she can talk about that. But I think it's just important for you, wherever you are, because I know there's people on this call from all over, to be demanding accountability from your governments relating both to the UN generally and also to UNRWA. So thank you again, and I apologize for my technical issue in the middle.
I should just probably apologize in advance because I'll probably have one. Anyway, thank you, Andrea, for putting on this webinar, and thank you, Dina, for your careful analysis of what happens in Geneva. And there's a little overlap, as you'll see, but not too much. Anyway, I'm Joan. I'm not only a physicist, but also a lifelong Zionist. I represent International Council of Jewish Women with a team of 4 other people at the United Nations in New York for over 15 years. I think my innocence lasted about 15 days. After that, I started to realize just how poisonous this organization can be. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you today. The systemic anti-Semitism at the United Nations. It should be discussed much more publicly and in many more newspapers than it has ever been. The UN, I will show you, among other things, that the UN behavior is at least partly responsible for the carnage in Israel on October 7th and then the subsequent war. Why are we talking about this? The UN continuously violates its own charter, which pledges equal protection for every single member nation. And I guess every single member nation except Israel tends to get protection. Israel's continually singled out for abuse, as you've already heard, and you'll hear a little more. And even the Office of the Secretary General puts out statements abusing Israel. It's really appalling. The education, particularly in the summer camps, but also in schools, it's about 550,000 students are now in 70 UNRWA schools. UNRWA did the world a real disservice by redefining refugee to be an inherited characteristic. So instead of having approximately 25 or 30,000 refugees left from 1948, we have millions, over 5 million. And all of them live, or 90% of them, I guess, live in UNRWA-operated refugee camps, because remember, UNRWA is supposed to give them education, medicine, etc. So it's a big responsibility, but unfortunately, UNRWA's execution of its responsibility is truly appalling. The summer camps are particularly obvious as a source of real trouble because what they do is train 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds, maybe up to 15 sometimes, to be soldiers for Hamas. And so that's where we got a lot of our soldiers that we saw on the 7th. So just a few facts and then a little bit of a movie. UNRWA was founded in 1949 to provide health, welfare, and education for Palestinians displaced by the 1948 war. They then added sometime later people displaced by the 67 war as well. They redefined refugee as an inherited characteristic, as I said, and they have never resettled even a single refugee. The United Nations has something called the High Commissioner for Refugees, which in the years since World War II, which is basically just a couple of years before UNRWA started, resettled every single refugee. They're in charge of all refugees in the world except Palestinians. And there are over 35,000 UNRWA employees as of right now. They have a $1.6 billion budget, much of which is provided by donor nations, of which I'm really happy to say the largest donor is the United States of America. More than half of that budget goes to education, and many of the teachers were educated in the same schools. This has been going on for 4 generations. So watch what happens. The students trained in these schools and these summer camps become the teachers and train the next generation of students to disrespect Jews, to hate Israel, to become martyrs, etc. And I think I'd like to show you a little film now, if David will help me. David Badin, with whom I work very closely, he's done more about documenting the textbooks and documenting the summer camps than any other person. And so I had big choice of films because he lets me use them all. He's really wonderful that way. It's not necessarily fun to watch, but David, if you could put it on, I'd appreciate it.
Hamas and Islamic Jihad Summer Camps 2021, the way children from UNRWA schools spent their summer vacation.
مخيم طلائع التحرير سيف القدس للعام 2021 الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
واحنا جيل فلسطين احنا بنعشق الشهاده.
والله احنا بنجاهد عشان القدس وعشان وطننا ونموت شهداء.
هاي جيل التحرير، بنحرر فلسطين والقدس وكل الدول المحتله.
جاي اتدرب عشان احارب اليهود لما اكبر وندافع عن القدس وعن فلسطين.
نتدرب ونستعد لأي حرب جاية، لأن نحن الجيل الجديد الذي يعود لأرضه وسنحرر الأقصى بإذن الله.
As the world has witnessed every year over the past decade, UNRWA students, even those who have not yet finished elementary school, are lured to participate in summer camps for armed guerrilla warfare. Allah! Allah! These children, who should expect UNRWA to provide a normal summer vacation environment, fall prey to terror groups that lurk everywhere, or are sent to these programs by their own parents. This summer, armed operatives signed up tens of thousands of UNRWA students ages 10 to 17 for summer camps offering extensive military training. Recruitment took place in mosques and at registration tables throughout the Gaza Strip.
Okay, well, I hope that wasn't too distressing. Every time I watch it, I sort of quiver a little bit. But I thought it was really an appropriate film to use because it was made in 2021. And in the first few scenes, there's no doubt that the students are old enough to have contributed their talents to October 7th as well. That's why I picked that particular film. So as I spent more and more time at the UN and became more the leader of the Jewish NGOs, we decided to start something called UNRWA Stop Teaching Hate. And we've been working with people all over the world to raise awareness of what you just saw. The problem has been to spread the word, to get more interest. So perhaps, as is often the case, this war will have at least one little bit of silver lining, because as a result of what's been going on, we've heard more and more from some really interesting people, one of them being a Black Christian reverend in Kenya, who states that the war against Hamas has exposed decay in the UN and its moral rot that has led to the molestation of its own statutes. I think that's beautifully put all the way from Kenya. The other thing is that the textbooks that are used are continually getting worse and worse in that they're more radical. 10 years ago, when I first started looking at this, there were not whole chapters on the ultimate war of return in which all the Jews will be exterminated. But now they're in every book, even in second graders' books. So why is UNRWA such a serious problem? Because they have provided all the education that has led up to this. So that if they want to recruit some sympathetic teachers, say in Gaza, all they have to do is look at their graduates or the parents of the current students. And in case you have any doubt about how closely UNRWA worked with Hamas through this war, I'll give you a few points. Hostages were kept in UNRWA employees' apartments. Many stayed with the families of UNRWA school teachers, and some suffered abuse and starvation while they were there. UNRWA workers are also human shields for Hamas, as in the hospitals. I'm sure you know about that. And as I said, they don't resettle anybody, so they've got more and more people. UNRWA employs registered Hamas members, and this is something distressing that seems to be getting more dominant. They employ many registered Hamas members in a wide variety of positions, not just teaching and security, which used to be where they recruited. So this all led up to a ready army of terrorists on October 7th. All financed by the UN through UNRWA. And remember, the United States of America pays a quarter of all UN expenses. So there you are. Does this make any sense? Not to me. Why do we have a designated terrorist organization in a tight and inseparable bond with a UN agency? What has happened? Well, I'll give you an interesting tale that shows you just how powerful this all is and then I'll go on to some other UN issues. But in 2021, well, first of all, I'm sure most of you remember that President Trump stopped paying UNRWA because he didn't like their education. But when Biden came in, he had to have a policy. So he signed an accord with UNRWA, and they signed it as well as us signing it, that the US would put all the money that it has pledged to UNRWA in escrow until the books were changed. So for 2 years, all aid to UNRWA from the United States was held up. Then all of a sudden, David Badin called me or sent me an emergency email. He had just been informed by the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs that the United States has decided, and this was just a couple of weeks ago, it will no longer abide by that accord and will instead forward all the money to UNRWA. So hence, we are now introducing a new era of incitement, more cash to produce more soldiers in the summer and more evil textbooks in the winter. Where does UNRWA get the books? This is another connection. There's a connection between UNRWA, Hamas, and now we're bringing in the Palestinian Authority, so that when Joe Biden says we should have the Palestinian Authority govern Gaza after the war, you will know why we should not do that, okay? It's the Palestinian Authority that publishes the books. They write them, they put in things like the War of Return and the Glory of Martyrdom, etc. And then UNRWA buys them from the Palestinian Authority. So that's bad in two senses. Sense one is we get those textbooks. Sense two is because UNRWA's paying for them, the PA has more money we can't touch to pay for slay. Now, they're the group that if you kill a Jew, you get a pension for life. So we're doing a double bad thing by having this connection. So the books are revised regularly, so there's a ready flow of money to the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and they can pay to slay more and more people. The latest version of the books, and I won't dwell on this, I've given whole lectures on it, but I won't dwell on it, I promise, just a few minutes. In the latest version, delegitimization of Israel and demonization of the Zionist entity are called for. Children are indoctrinated for war, not peace. Reconciliation is never even mentioned. nor is Israel or a map that has Israel's name on it. The land is occupied not by Jews. Remember, they say the Jews are illegal occupants, but they don't even say that in these books. They say the land is occupied by a Zionist entity, which must be eliminated during a war of return. And then the teachers, I have a teacher's manual in English. That's just wonderful. There sort of describes to them how to discuss and glorify martyrdom and jihad, including the murder of Jews. The books that I study from are in English. They were translated by a gentleman named Dr. Arnon Groys, who works with David Badine, who speaks fluent Arabic and fluent Hebrew. So a better translator would be hard to find. And as the books have gotten more radical in the last few years, they have also emphasized more the war of return. The most hideous example of all to me, in second grade, a song is sung that addresses the issue of what we're supposed to do, we Palestinians, with, quote, the remnant of the Zionists once the Palestinians have won the war. And what we're supposed to do with the remnant of the Zionists is push them all into the sea. So that's what the books look like. Not very nice. No map identifies any Jewish cities. The cities that are named are ancient cities. There's no Tel Aviv and no Haifa and so on. So clearly, the PA that is selling these textbooks and using them in its own schools is not the right government for Gaza. If you go away with no other thought from me today, please go away with that thought. We can't have a government of Gaza that wants to push all the Jews into the sea. It doesn't make any sense. Even the UN has to realize that. In addition to the internal problems like corruption and pay to slay, the PA is also closely connected to Hamas through the books and the camps and so on. So we have to definitely debunk this notion that we can have a two-state solution that the PA governs. It's not going to happen. Not in real life, not in the next N years. I sometimes wake up in the morning. My first slogan is, the path to peace begins in the classroom. My second slogan, I wake up some mornings and I say, well, 25 years to go, because there won't be peace until an entire generation of Palestinians is re-educated, and that will take a minimum of 25 years. So that's, I could stop right here. A discussion of UNRWA is enough to establish the incredible harm done, but I do have a few other things to say, so if you don't mind, I'll go on. Why is UNRWA still with us? One significant reason is that for a long time, the state of Israel was loath to have its friends destroy UNRWA because they feared they would have to provide hospitals, schools, and so on for 5 million people. But that's changed, and one of my favorite conversations ever, I was having lunch at a synagogue in New York, sitting next to Danny Danon, who was then an ambassador of Israel to the UN. I told him what I was doing about trying to get rid of UNRWA, and he said, and I quote in English, "Go get them, girl." So that was my one of my moments, so to speak. So let me just quickly go over another really important issue, because I firmly believe that in understanding current events in history, you must follow the money. An enormous amount of money is spent on UNRWA, but the UN spends another almost equal amount on a whole collection of organizations, some of which Dina alluded to. There's the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, and they are the ones who came up with this notion of making Nakba Day an official holiday. So you know what they're like. Then there's the COI, which Dina covered very well. But the money that it costs, if we're following the money, is enormous, because not only is it to exist in perpetuity, but there are dozens of people traveling all around the world on UN funds to investigate Israel's sins. So that there's money there. Then there's something called UNISPAL, which keeps track of the history of the Palestinians. And I recommend to you, we have no time for it here, look it up and look for the 4-minute video on the history of the Palestinians. It is one lie after another, and it's really, in some sense, amusing. So, and as Dina mentioned, and I'll mention a little bit too, it's not just the specifically targeted organizations which focus on Israel. Virtually every single organization in the United Nations is biased against Israel and shows it one way or another. The GA she covered, but the fact that it's always at least twice as many resolutions against Israel as the rest of the world, I find remarkable. UNESCO and UNICEF often do offensive things, but nothing too horrendous. To me, one of the most horrendous things that's happened is that UN Women, of which I used to be very active and I'm not anymore, did not mention that a single Jewish woman was attacked by Hamas. Not one. And the only reason they finally said something is because, God bless the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Mr. Erdan, he put together with a few Jewish women's organizations a program on December 4th called Hear Our Voices. And they made it very clear that there had been an enormous cost to Jewish women on that day, and that it was appalling that nothing was said. And very rarely does anything I talk about get in the mainstream press. But 2 days after the UN program on December 4th, Bret Stephens, who was one of my heroes, wrote an article in the New York Times entitled "An Appalling Silence for Israeli Rape Victims." And sadly, but perhaps accurately, I think, he ascribed the lack of attention to those atrocities by all the women's organizations at the UN and largely in the world, except a few Jewish ones, the lack of interest. And according to him, that's sort of the definition of anti-Semitism. So I'm not going to go into this court nonsense that Israel's being sued by South Africa, of all people, for genocide. I mean, come on, give me a break. But Hamas is guilty of genocide, if you want to get technical. Their charter, issued in 1988, says, I'm going to read this so I don't say anything. Israel will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it. Our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. And that brings me to one of my favorite points. We must start believing every word the Arabs say when they're speaking Arabic. We give them benefit of the doubt that they're really not going to kill everybody, and then if we translate their Arabic speaking, we find different things. So as I wrap up, anti-Semitism is so pervasive at the UN that it's probably unstoppable. So our first goal should be make sure the world learns more about it. Just as I believe the education these kids get is important, I believe education. We should be every day trying to get in some newspaper in some country what goes on at the UN. I just can't help it. And a few other thoughts, just take me a minute or two. I think we're sort of running out of time, but
We're fine. We can go over time, Joan.
we can. Okay, then I will finish up what I was going to say, which is it's time for the UN to do some soul searching. I truly don't believe that every UN employee is anti-Semitic. What I do believe, and I have seen with my own eyes, is that many UN employees who now live in New York and probably in Geneva also, but I don't know about that. Many of the ones who now live in New York come from very downtrodden, poor countries, And if they protest too loud, they fear they will be back in their jungle hut instead of educating their children in New York City. And I think that's a really big and serious problem. So somehow or other, we need for the government to get after the UN to do some soul searching. For one thing, all of this huge apparatus that they have putting all this money into has really accomplished nothing. We haven't resettled any Palestinians. We don't have many happy Palestinians as far as I can make out. So maybe they should think of something else to do. It seems to me that's something we should mention more often than we do. And what else? Oh, and the other one was when Bibi Netanyahu was, I think, first approached by Biden about giving up fighting and so on and so forth, he said peace will require three things. The 3 Ds, he called them: destruction of the tunnels and the other infrastructure that enables Hamas to get around so well, demilitarization, stricter security so that more weapons don't get into Gaza, and destruction of their weapons factories. And thirdly, de-radicalization. And he was asked what that meant, and he said, teach peace, not war, to the youth. He absolutely agrees with me, hopefully with the idealists at the UN, that this Hamas, this UNRWA education has got to stop. So what else do we know? UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who many of us believed for a few years, and we hear him at least 2 or 3 times a year, we believed he was better than the prior few secretaries general in his attitude toward the Jews. At least at Holocaust Memorial Day he was. But he has made the following statement: ambassadors and foreign ministers who refuse to accept a 2-state solution now must be rejected. The clear and repeated rejection of a Palestinian state by Israeli leaders is unacceptable. How can he be failing to notice that the Palestinians don't want 2 states? They have no desire for 2 states, none whatsoever. All they want is 1 state with no Jews. So, what can I say? Gilad Erdan, who is another one of my heroes, what do you think will happen if there is a ceasefire? I'll tell you what will happen. Hamas will remain in power, regroup, and rearm. And soon Israel will face another attempted Holocaust. So I hate to end on that cheery note, but I hope I've at least convinced you that things must be done and certain things must be changed. And if you have any questions.
For sure. Thank you so much, Joan and Dina. Wow, it's very powerful. I just want to mention to people that CAEF also works with David Bedin and shares a lot of his information. And I think that's important. And I say that because everybody here and every sponsoring organization should be doing the same. I think if everyone would share the information, you know, pass it on, publicize it, send it to your media, talk to your elected officials, congressmen and members of parliament, it could go a long way.
Yes.
So I'll start with that, and I'm going to throw a few questions out from the audience and a few that I've prepared. And I think it's interesting that both in Geneva and New York, you're seeing the same thing. So this
is absolute consistency. It's really terrible.
So a simple question, Dina, maybe you could start. We know that, we believe, I should say, that Western democracies support Israel. They're at the UN. Do they do anything to demonstrate their support? Could they be doing more? What could they do?
Okay. Well, they could definitely be doing more. I would say let's start with the resolutions. On the General Assembly resolutions, for example, European countries, EU countries, so those are Western democracies, they basically support 70% of the resolutions against Israel. At the Human Rights Council, I think there's one resolution that the one on the Syrian Golan that pretty much they all vote against, but then they either abstain or support the rest of the resolutions. Now, there's a few countries, if we're talking about Western democracies, like the United States and actually Canada, that have a better voting record at the UN when it comes to Israel. But it's not just about the voting. There's other things too, like Joan mentioned, the funding. You know, these countries, at the end of the day, they vote to perpetuate UNRWA. They approve UN budgets that give money to this commission of inquiry, this perpetual commission of inquiry. And I think the funding is really a key to all of this UN apparatus against Israel. And so, yes, Western democracies should be.
Want to say something?
Okay.
No,
think that
finish,
more
but when you're finished, I want to answer the question too.
Yeah, they should be putting more pressure on the UN. They should be denying budgets for these kinds of activities. And I'm sure, yeah.
Are they too few in number? Are we?
No, can I speak to that point and this question in general?
Yeah.
Among my other pastimes, I'm on the advisory board of a group called American Jewish International Relations Institute, founded originally by Ambassador Richard Shifter, who died unfortunately at the age of 98. I mean, that was fortunate, but his son has now taken over. Their one and only mission, and we need to advertise this, and we need to get more people involved in this. It's very important. Their one and only mission is to find countries that traditionally either abstain or vote against Israel, but they really concentrate on the abstainers to try to get them to change their votes so that at least some of these resolutions, even if they pass, there will be at least a decent number of objectors, if you know what I mean. So I think, I'm sure there are other organizations which do it too, but this particular group is in Washington, D.C., and they're very active with sending people to Congress. They sometimes work with Sarah Stern of Emet to do this same mission. And before the General Assembly opens in the fall, some of us are invited to go to meetings at missions that meet that criterion. That is, they don't vote for Israel, but they don't vote against either. And sometimes we actually change a vote. So it really is a rewarding thing to do, but everybody who's in the New York for the UN's opening in September is so busy that you need to get someone really important to get yourself a foot in the door, literally. And once you have a foot in the door, like I had a foot in the Estonian door, we actually got Estonia to change their vote against an anti-Israel regulation. So I just wanted to mention that because I didn't have time for it in the mainstream, but I think it's an effort that's somewhat mature. And so we could try to get between us all more people to be active.
Several people have asked the question about the value of the UN overall and whether it's time for Western to pull out. What value is there in staying in? Could they form a different international entity? Dina, do you want to address that?
The question is, would we get a better one? And that's a big question.
Well, but maybe it's a separate one. Maybe there needs to be, I mean, right now there's the G7, the G20, presumably they have some international clout.
Okay, that's different. That's a different question.
Come back as a group at the UN and behave like a group.
Yes, that's a different question. I have more sympathy for that question. I like the idea of trying to make the G7, the G20, whatever is happening next, more aware. And again, that's another possible silver lining from this war. I'm sure this has been discussed, and more people are aware of the horrendous background of this war. I mean, if nobody had been educating those kids to go out and kill Jews, Hamas would have had to go get more money to hire trainers. So, you know, there is something that's maybe attackable. But
so maybe mention for our audience, if they don't know, if you're in Canada, the response here has been really quite abysmal. And as a result of the attack by Hamas, I guess it's not, you can't say it's the cause, but since there is a war going on, Canada's actually increased the amount of money for UNRWA. In December, at the end of December, they announced a huge increase.
Why?
Because of course there's a humanitarian need now, right? This is how it's been presented.
Oh,
Yeah, it's very scary.
very scary.
So Dina, from the perspective in Europe, do you see changes there given what's happening? I read recently that the EU was actually going to now demand a two-state solution.
Yeah, well, I've read also different things about that. I think that, just to get back to your previous question, the UN is the body that it's the world, it's the international body that exists, and I don't think it would help for any country to pull out, like for Israel to pull out or for the US to pull out. At the end of the day, it would just isolate Israel more. And in terms of changes that are happening now, it's hard for me to say. I think that what we see overall is very upsetting, the UN response. And while, you know, some states have been supportive of Israel in their public statements and also in their actions, but as time goes on, you know, it's getting less. And these insistence now on putting the two-state solution like at the forefront of the agenda, I just think it doesn't appreciate the facts on the ground, you know, and it's not the time for that kind of discussion.
There is another issue that neither one of us has actually raised directly that has to do with maybe Israel should someday think about leaving the UN, but not right now. That is that Israel's psyche, their whole culture, has been upset terribly by this unprecedented attack. And as a result, people are rethinking security and how to get it. And one of the sayings that I heard that absolutely threw me, a woman author who was living on one of the kibbutzim where many people were killed, said, life will never be the same while Hamas is in Gaza, because clearly many people believe that's never going away. Because, she said, I used to be an Israeli and now I'm a Jew. And many Israelis, especially the ones who weren't very religious, did not really worry about anti-Semitism and things like that. And now it's all there. So I don't know. I don't think you can do anything with some of the things that are happening in the UN. But do you throw the UN away? I vary, but I really think that some of the bad actors, especially at the Human Rights Council, Dina, who never get punished because Israel's absorbing all their punishment, they would take over any new organization and we'd be right back where we started from, only possibly worse.
That did happen with forming the Human Rights Council a few years ago, right?
So yeah, that's right.
I think that's the inevitable problem of having a world body that includes 193 member states, that it's basically like operates like a democracy where it gives each state one vote. And so then the natural result of that is, you know, this automatic anti-Israel majority. And it's not just an anti-Israel majority, it's an anti-Western majority.
Yes.
So,
and the war is not just against Israel. This is a war against the West. Read my friend Melanie Phillips.
Right. So maybe that's the note we'll end on. And I can tell you, having read the Freedom House report this week, the number of democracies in the world has shrunk over the last 3 or 5 years.
I saw that. I didn't know that.
Very concerning. And even countries that are democratic are less so. And the number of tyrannies has increased. So we should be, as a world, quite concerned. And I say that Israel's on the front of defending Western civilization right now.
That's true.
Think of it that way.
It's absolutely true.
And a lot of great questions posed here, ladies. I'm going to forward them to you. David will capture the chat.
Please do.
Okay, and then we can try to follow up with some responses when we send out this recording. And we will also distribute the film that you shared with us, Joan, so people can have access to that. And Dina, anything else that you would like, we can attach to the following material. And I should say to everybody, I send it out not just to the people who have registered or the people who have attended today, but to our list of 6,000 people across the globe. So we'll encourage everybody to share and share. We have a lot of work to do, and I look forward to continuing to work with both of you. And thank you so much for what you've prepared today. And
Thank you, Andrea, for giving us the chance to put it together.
Thank you.
I'm still looking for a co-author for my next dedicated paper on follow the money at the UN.
Well, there, Dina, is your next project. Thank you so much. And please stay well. Take care.
You too.
Thanks again to all of the organizations that have partnered and sponsored our program today. I hope that you will do so again in the near future.
Hamas and Islamic Jihad Summer Camps 2021, the way children from UNRWA schools spent their summer vacation.
مخيم طلائع التحرير سيف القدس للعام 2021 الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
واحنا جيل فلسطين احنا بنعشق الشهادة.
والله احنا بنجاهد عشان القدس وعشان وطننا ونموت شهداء.
هاي جيل التحرير هان بنحرر فلسطين والقدس وكل الدول المحتلة.
جاي اتدرب عشان احارب اليهود لما اكبر وندافع عن القدس وعن فلسطين.
نتدرب ونستعد لأي حرب جاية، لأن نحن الجيل الجديد الذي يعود لأرضه، وسنحرر الأقصى بإذن الله.
As the world has witnessed every year over the past decade, UNRWA students, even those who have not yet finished elementary school, are lured to participate in summer camps for armed guerrilla warfare. Allah! Allah! These children, who should expect UNRWA to provide a normal summer vacation environment, fall prey to terror groups that lurk everywhere, or are sent to these programs by their own parents. This summer, armed operatives signed up tens of thousands of UNRWA students ages 10 to 17 for summer camps offering extensive military training. Recruitment took place in mosques and at registration tables throughout the Gaza Strip.
إن صراعنا مع عدونا هو صراع على الجيل، ومن يكسب الجيل في النهاية يكسب المعركة.
دربونا شوي نتعامل مع التيس الشرس النتنياهو ونفتالي بنات وحط القملة على البرغوث ونفتالي بنات يا رب يموت.
دستوركم سبيلكم أسمع منيكم
At terrorist bases belonging to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the youngsters experienced intense military discipline and systematic indoctrination with one objective in mind: to fight and die for jihad and to annihilate the Jewish state.
احنا جيل التحرير وهذه الأرض إلنا، واليهود مش راح يضلوا على هذه الأرض. أنا بقولهم إنهم يرجعوا من حيث أتوا، اطلعوا قبل من بيتكم وإحنا راح نحرر هذه الأرض. إذا مات شهيد راح يجي بداله 1000 شهيد.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أعد جيلا يحمل هذا السيف
At the summer camps, UNRWA youngsters learned to view the United States and Israel as the devil, the ultimate enemy. They trampled on the flags of both nations and set them afire.
سنعمل أن تستمر جدوى الصراع حتى يوقن بأنه لا مجال له إلا الرحيل.
جايين اليوم احنا عند مخيمات سيف القدس اقترب الوعد حتى نبني اجسامنا واجسادنا حتى نقهر بني صهيون ونرجع على اراضينا المحتله.
كان اليهود ما لهمش قيمه هنا، يعني ما لهمش ارض. نتدرب نجاهد في سبيل الله وهذا نستشهد ان شاء الله في سبيل الله.
تكبير تكبير.
حلمي انه اطلع اني يعني اصير دكتور ومقاوم، يعني علم مع جهاد في سبيل الله، وعشان نحرر فلسطين ونطهرها من اليهود من الاحتلال الصهيوني المجرم.
مفيش حاجة اسمها دولة إسرائيل أصلا عشان يكون لهم عاصمة قبل كل شيء. إذا القدس عاصمة فلسطين الأبدية.
They learned how to use automatic weapons of all kinds. Instructors taught them how to assemble each weapon, hold it correctly, and operate it.
أول إشي تدريب، أول إشي يعلمونا طريقة اسم السلاح وفك السلاح وكيف تنظيف. ثاني إشي طريقة حمل السلاح. ثالث إشي عندك التدريب القوي، بدك من تحت الزحف تدريب. ثالث إشي إن نحمل وكيف نطخ لقدام، نتعلم كيف نطخ ونصوب الأهداف القريبة، ونتعلم على الأسلحة بأنواعها. المدربين ما شاء الله عليهم هان بيعلموا كل أنواع الأسلحة هان.
The terrorists working as camp instructors provided them with detailed descriptions of the mortars used by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and even of the tanks used by the Israel Defense Forces. The UNRWA youngsters practiced fighting in built-up areas as well as commandeering a vehicle.
احنا ما بنقدر نحرر الا بالسلاح، زي ما هم بحاربونا بالسلاح احنا حنحرر بالسلاح. هي هيك المعادله، ما بيفهموا الا بلغه السلاح.
One exercise featured a mock-up of an Israeli tank. The idea was to teach the children how to sneak up on a tank and kidnap Israeli soldiers.
عشان هيك احنا بنحارب وبنتعلم من الصغر. عشان ايش؟ عشان لما نكبر نبقى مستعدين لمقاتلة اليهود وتطردهم من البلد، لانه هذه مش بلدهم، يرجعوا بلدهم. هذه مش بلدهم، هذه بلدنا. لما اكبر بدي استشهد واعمل عمليات مدافع عن وطني وعن ارضي. هذه فلسطين. انا والله نفسي استشهد.
حط السيف قبال السيف واحنا رجال محمد ضيف.
نعلمهم فن القتال مع هذا العدو المغتصب الذي اغتصب أرضنا، فنحن سنعد هذا الجيل ومن أجل أن نفجر جماجم هذا العدو.
من تحت الأرض نخرج إليكم ندق الرعب في قلوبكم، ومن فوق الأرض بصواريخنا نقطعكم أشلاء.
Top commanders from Hamas and Islamic Jihad were in charge of the military training and stated clearly that the goal was for the youngsters to take part in the future battle against Israel.
الكبار أرضعوا الصغار حب الوطن وحب الجهاد وحب الاستشهاد.
The children attending the summer camps were taught about their so-called inalienable right of return to cities inside Israel, such as Jaffa, Lod, Haifa, Beersheba, Ashdod, and Ashkelon. With these cities just kilometers away, they were told that a return was literally in reach.
ان شاء الله بدنا نرجع، وان شاء الله كل كتاب القسم حيكونوا معنا، لانه هذه بلدتنا الاصليه راح نحررها غصب عنه.
ان الاحتلال الصهيوني طرد ابائنا واجدادنا من اجلنا لنضحي في دمنا ونرجع حيفا والجاهد الجهاد.
نحن نساء جهادي ضد الشهاده دربنا.
Girls affiliated with Islamic Jihad happily recited the mantras of terror. They are an integral part of the movement, meant to show that terrorism is not a male-dominated system.
لابد لنا أن نقوم ببناء جيل قرآني واعي. لابد لنا كأمهات فلسطينيات أن نرسل أبناؤنا إلى هذه الأماكن لنزرع فيهم حب البلاد، حب فلسطين، حب الجهاد.
لابد أن كل امرأة منا تكون أم الشهيد، أخت الشهيد، يعني نزيد الوعي الثقافي عند أبنائنا حتى يجي يوم وهذه الأطفال يصير يعني مقاومة وتصير تدافع هي عن الأرض ونرجعها إلنا.
The women of Islamic Jihad bestowed the legacy of their cause on the next generation. Notably, the summer camps featured the photos of female suicide bombers who blew themselves up to murder Jews.
أنا بلدة الأصلية بلدة يبنى، وحنعود عليها بالحجر والسكينة.
هم أصلا أعداء ويهود. من هم اليهود؟ هم طبعا قبائل تجمعت من كل دول العالم وأجهد كونوا لهم وطن كما يدعون لهم في فلسطين.
حط السيف في قبال السيف، حط السيف في قبال السيف، احنا رجال محمد ضيف، احنا رجال محمد ضيف.
As the summer camps drew to a close, each camper received a certificate of appreciation complete with his photo, attesting to the completion of formal weapons training and a readiness to fight the Jews. For the UNRWA students, these photos depicted them with automatic weapons and showed them imbued with ideological motivation.
الذين يشبهون المجاهدين في أعمالهم ويتشبهون بهم وهم مجاهدون المستقبل بإذن الله.
Clearly, the Hamas and Islamic Jihad summer camps have become training grounds for the vilification of Israel. UNRWA teachers and textbooks complement this with an ideology and curriculum that promotes armed struggle for the right of return. Last May, the most recent outbreak of anti-Israel violence in Gaza exposed a tunnel dug by Hamas under a school in UNRWA's Zaytun refugee camp. Here is the evidence. Hamas thus takes the UNRWA children captive not only during the summer, but during the school year itself. UNRWA students constitute a future terror army aimed at liquidating Israel based on the illusion of a right of return. UNRWA can no longer act as if it does not know. UNRWA is proud of its 400 schools in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, and Jerusalem. It allocates 58% of its budget for an education system that indoctrinates a new generation for war. In essence, it has abandoned its students. The time has come for UNRWA to teach peace and coexistence during both the school year and summer vacation. The time has come for the world to demand oversight of UNRWA schools. The time has come for donor nations to put an end to UNRWA anarchy.
أنا اسمي ضياء أبو الديب، صف سادس، عمر 12، يافا.
أنا اسمي حمزة بوهين من بلد برير.
اسمي قصاية، عمري 13 سنة، من المجدة.
أنا من بلدة حمامة، اسمي خالد.
أنا اسمي آسر البيك من بلدة هربيا. شمس يوسف ياسين من حيفا.
اسمي عاصم فرج من الشجاعية وأصلي من بئر السبع.
أنا اسمي براب سكران، عمري 15 سنة، أنا أصلي من المجدة.
عبد الله 9 يافا.
محمد عبد الله سليم 13 سنة، بئر السبع.
فايز عبد الكريم مصباح الداية 12 من حيفا.
أنا اسمي أسماء الجرا، أنا بلدة الأصلية بلدة يبنى.
اسمي فداء أبو طيور، لاجئة، أصلي من بلدة سرفند العمار.